looking at verse 22 through 23, and we're getting into 24 and 25 this morning, but it's to kind of bring us back into this. Verse 22 is talking about submission, and the headship is explained here in verse 23, and then submission's clarified in verse 24. Love is then defined in verse 25 down through verse 33. Everything kind of builds outward then from these verses here. And as we've said throughout this mini section here in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18 down through verse 21 kind of describes our relationship with God, how a life that is living where the world can see Christ is a life of worship, it's a life of gratitude, and it's a life of submission. And then we talk about submission with the husband and wife and that relationship and how Paul says that this pertains to Christ and the church. And then we see how obedience to God is key in obedience to parents. And then we see how our relationships outside of the family, slaves and masters in chapter 6, how that applies to our relationship with God as well. So once we kind of get down through this point here, the book of Ephesians is going to go pretty fast. We don't have a lot of time left in the book, and then we'll take a break and do some, there's been some topics that have been requested, so we'll take a break and focus on those for a while. But we shouldn't have too many more weeks left in the book of Ephesians here. Submission, and we're just going to go through this here real quick. Submission is not cultural hierarchy, as what it is often viewed as within our culture today. Oh, that was just something cultural. That was just something cultural back in the time, that the man was the one who had to have the submission, and you have male superiority. It's not permission for abuse. In fact, when Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says that I commend you in the traditions given to you, and talks about how from creation, this was the order that God made. It is not some cultural hierarchy, but rather it is a created order come all the way from the very beginning of time. It is divine structure. It is Christ-centered authority. You know, the man may have authority over the wife, the husband over the wife in the worship services. The man may have authority over the woman. However, they are not the authority. Christ is the authority in all things. And leadership is defined not by position, not by skills, not by time in service, not by experience, but rather leadership within the church, within the family, is defined by sacrifice. And we'll get into that here in just a moment as we continue on down through this, as we look at the sacrifice, the type of leadership that Christ has. It is an order that reflects God's design. We looked at creation, and from the very beginning, this is an order that God designed from the beginning. Paul does not say husbands lead because they are men. That's not at all what Paul says here in Ephesians 5. It's not what he says there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and other places where we see this hierarchy being listed out. He doesn't say lead because they're men. He says husbands lead because Christ is head. And we understand why that is through that created order. Marriage only makes sense when it is understood through Jesus Christ. The husband's headship in marriage is grounded in and defined by Christ's headship over the church, an authority marked by responsibility, unity, and sacrificial care. No, it's not, as we said, the husband is not in a leadership role because of his experience, because he's a male. He is in leadership position because this is grounded and defined by Christ's headship over the church. Again, it's an authority marked by responsibility, by unity, and sacrificial care. Let's kind of tighten this up here real quick. Our next verse, in verse 24, is where Paul flips it back to the church and says that, now, here's what submission actually looks like in light of all these things. The husband is head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church. And here's what that looks like. Our marriages, they represent what God has shown, or Paul has shown what God planned in chapter 1. He's shown what Christ accomplished in chapter 2. He's shown what was revealed in chapter 3. He has shown what we must live in chapter 4. And then he now shows what it looks like in the closest relationship that we have on the face of this earth. The relationship between husband and wife. Can we see how from the very beginning, as God created this earthly institution of marriage, how it represents what God planned to do for mankind down through the ages. As God planned to reconcile mankind to him, as God planned to sacrifice his son in order that man's sins might be forgiven, what does Paul say later on there in the text? That Christ dies for the church. He sacrifices himself for the church for why? So that she may be without spot and without blemish. And in that same way, the husbands lead their wives and their families. We represent everything. Our relationship one to another represents everything that God planned from the very beginning. Now, as we'll see here in just a moment, marriage is not the main topic here in Ephesians chapter 5. Just like in verse 18, alcohol is not the main topic, but rather that dichotomy, that difference, that distinction between a life of excess and a life in Christ. How he uses alcohol as the representative of that. Marriage is the representation of what Christ has done for the church. We live in a type and shadow, if you will, type of relationship that when our relationship is right, when it is grounded in truth, grounded in love, and it is a proper marriage, we represent Christ and the church. As we said, marriage is not the main thing here. He's not primarily teaching on marriage. He's explaining Christ and the church. Just like with our husbands and wives, he says, this is the relationship between Christ and the church. This is a mystery, but I say that it pertains to Christ and the church. What is that about? Verse 32 or verse 33? Marriage is then the clearest illustration of how the church represents Christ to the world. Remember, Ephesians chapter 5 that we said is the world sees what God has revealed. Chapter 4 is we live it and the world sees it in us. Well, this is just one area, one thing that the world sees through us. The relationship points beyond itself. When our relationship is right, it points to the relationship between Christ and the church. And I don't know why I have this in here twice. I'm sorry. Why does this matter? Marriage is not personal. Marriage is visible theology. Marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. So if our marriages aren't right, if our marriages are struggling, if our marriages are broken, what does that represent about Christ and the church? The way we live in marriage teaches something about Jesus Christ. Distorted marriages distort the picture. That's why God has certain rules set aside and set forth for marriage. That's why from the beginning, divorce and remarriage was not so, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19. Faithful marriages clarify the picture of Christ and the church. Some final thoughts on this here. Paul has not shifted topics, but he's bringing everything down to a point, just as he has done all the way down through the entire book. You know, we seem like we're shifting into something different, and then it just snaps right back to the central theme, which is Christ's body and God's eternal purpose. And we'll get there in just a moment. Paul's not shifted topics. He has brought everything down to a point. What God planned, what Christ accomplished, what was revealed, and how we must live is now seen clearly in this: Christ and his church. Ephesians 5 and verse 24, the pattern as the church to Christ. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Verse 23 is the foundation. Verse 24 now gives the pattern and the extent. How does the church submit to Christ? Or how does the wife submit to the husband? Well, just like the church submits to Christ. How far does the wife submit to the husband? How far does submission go? Well, how far does submission go for Christ and the church? It requires 100% submission, right? For us to live in Christ. Same thing for the husband and wife. Now this is the standard here is the church. He doesn't point to culture. He doesn't point to a preference. He points to the church's relationship to Jesus Christ. The church is the model. Christ remains the reference. Marriage is explained through that relationship of Christ and the church. Submission is not undefined. It's measured by how the church responds to Christ. The church submits to Christ. What that looks like, the comparison here is the key. The church submission is willing, trusting, faithful, and dependent. And I missed blowing that up to a larger size. Sorry. It is not forced. It is not resentful. It is not selective. It's not negotiated. The church lives under Christ's authority because he is Lord. And it's got to be the same way for our relationships as well. Let's back it up here and go back to that previous slide. The church submission is willing. Well, our earthly relationships must be willing as well. It is trusting. Husbands, that leaves a great responsibility on us that we are the type of people that can be trusted. We are the type of people that our wives can put their trust in, that they can fully submit to. It is faithful. We've got to be the type of people that the wife can be faithful to. It is dependent. The wife has to depend upon us, just like we have to depend upon Christ. Again, this is not forced just because that's the way it is. Well, obviously she has her responsibility to God as well, that she has to submit, but we don't need it to be forced. It can't be, she doesn't need to resent us. We don't resent Christ in any way. If we are true followers of Christ, we're not resentful for anything in our life. We're not resentful because, well, we can't go and do this or we can't do that, or because we're being held back from some. We're not resentful in any way. We're happy and we're joyful. It's not selective. It's not, well, I agree with you, so I'm going to submit to you. I don't agree with you, so I'm not going to submit. It's not selective. We don't negotiate terms with Jesus Christ. We don't get to say that, well, you want this, but I want this. I can't tell you how many times, and I've heard people say that, well, my wife went off and bought this, so I turned around and I went off and I did that. This person did this party did this, and so because you did that, well, then I'm going to go do this over here. We don't negotiate. It's not negotiated. The church lives under Christ's authority because he is Lord. What was it that 1 Peter says about the women of the church, that as Sarah submitted to Abraham, calling him Lord, and if you do well, you're the daughters of Sarah? Is that what he says? So also, this is a direct, practical application. Paul's not softening it in any way. What he's saying is, in the same manner. Our relationships must be the same way. It's lived. It's not theoretical. It's not occasional. It's daily. And then it's not abstract. It's relational. How we relate to one another, how we live with one another, how we respect one another, how we trust one another, how the wife submits to the husband, how the husband is somebody that is trustworthy, that is faithful, that's dependent, that can be submitted to. All these things relate one to another. Marriage is the place where our relationship with Christ is practiced in everything. That's the scope of our submission. And again, the marriage is not the main topic here. Our submission to Christ as the church is the main topic. Marriage is the example for the application. This phrase carries weight, and so we have to handle it carefully. It means in every area of the marriage relationship, in the full pattern of life together, in the normal order of the home. If the marriage is the example of how Christ and the church is, then no wonder how we must have everything in order so that Christ and the church can be in order. It does not mean against Christ's will, in sin, outside of God's authority. The standard is still as to the Lord. Christ remains the boundary. How do we connect this back to our text? Genesis gave us a structure. Christ gives the meaning, the Spirit gives the power, and now here in verse 24, we have our practice. It's not new instruction, it's Spirit-filled life, Ephesians 5:18 through 21, applied in our relationships one to another. And here we are tying it back into Christ's purpose, or God's purpose from the eternal age. Christ's body. The church submits to Christ as head. That same pattern is reflected in marriage. Order and unity are preserved through proper roles. Just like we've talked about unity in the church and having our place and knowing our roles and stepping up where we need to, order and unity are preserved through proper roles, especially within the marriage. The body functions rightly under Christ's authority. And then God's eternal purpose. God designed this structure from creation. From the beginning, it was not so. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 19, Christ fulfills and reveals its meaning. Marriage displays God's wisdom visibly. The relationship points to something greater than itself. This verse does not elevate marriage. It reveals what marriage was always meant to show. Why did God create such an earthly institution? Why did God create it how we would be one of the few, dare I say, species upon the face of the earth that are supposed to have lifelong partners? Why are we that way? Well, this is the way that God always meant it to be. It does not create submission. Just like the church does not create unity, we maintain unity. This does not create submission. It defines it through Christ and the church. Paul's not asking how should marriage work here. He's showing this is how the church relates to Christ, and your marriage reflects that reality. Our marriages, that holy relationship, reflects what God designed for Christ and the church. A wife's submission in marriage reflects the church willing, faithful, and Christ-centered submission, making visible the relationship between Christ and his people. Moving on into Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. A few minutes left here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. If submission in verse 22 through 24 feels like a heavy topic and a heavy responsibility, this gets heavier. Because now, husbands, we have to imitate Christ. Husbands, love. Here's our primary command. Paul does not say lead. Paul does not say rule. Paul does not say assert authority. He says to love. I think there's a key difference there. And now, definitely, there's a leadership aspect to that. Definitely, there's a rule aspect. Definitely, there's an authority aspect. But love. Not just lead, not rule, not assert, but love. Authority is assumed. Love is commanded. It is not cultural expectations. It's not personal preference. It's not an emotional feeling, but it is Christ himself. And so the question becomes, what does Christ love look like? If we are to love our wives as Christ loved the church, what does that love look like? He says here that he gave himself up for her. There's the definition of love. Love is defined at the cross. Christ's love is sacrificial. He gave himself for us. Christ's love is voluntary. He willingly emptied himself and took upon himself the form of a servant, becoming lower than the angels, right? Christ's love was costly. It cost him everything. It cost him his position in heaven. It cost him even his position in the Godhead. And it's seen through John chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. But then, as we see Christ down upon earth, he dies, he fulfills the scheme of redemption. He goes back up into heaven, not to take up his place as God again, but rather to sit at the right hand of the throne of God. He goes back up into heaven and sits in a different position than what he was in before. He sacrificed himself. He gave up everything in order that he might sanctify us. And he didn't just do it for any old reason. He did it for her good. He did it for the good of the church. His love is purposeful. It's not sentiment, it is self-giving. Headship, verse 23, is defined by sacrifice in verse 25. Authority is not taking, demanding, or controlling. It is giving, serving, and laying down oneself. If headship does not look like the cross, it is not biblical headship. If the man's role in the family does not look like the cross, he is not fulfilling his role within the family. Again, going back to the structure. Christ gives the meaning. Verse 24 showed submission, and now verse 25 defines our leadership. And it does it by saying, look at Christ. Verse 24, submission is full and submission is real. Verse 25, love is total and love is sacrificial. Neither side is light. Both are demanding. Both carry certain responsibilities about them. Both carry certain consequences if those responsibilities are not carried out. Both have drastic impact, in good or bad, upon the church, upon the future of the church, upon the future generations, if we do not fulfill our God-given roles. Christ loved the church sacrificially. The body is cared for, it's nourished, it's protected. Leadership exists for the good of the body. Not just for the good of the head, but for the good of the body. The church depends on Christ's self-giving love. God planned a people to redeem through sacrifice. Christ accomplished that through the cross. Marriage now reflects that same sacrificial pattern. God's purpose is displayed through self-giving love. This is not a passive love. His love is not emotional affection alone. It's not occasional sacrifice. These things were a daily self-denial, intentional care, and active sacrifice, and Christ-shaped leadership. Paul does not say husbands lead like men. He says to love like Christ. Christ doesn't just lead the church. Christ died for the church. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Christ's example is full and complete. A husband's love in marriage is defined by Christ's sacrificial, self-giving love for the church, where authority is expressed through laying down self for the good of another. And I want to delve a little bit deeper into this idea here of Christ's love being the standard. As Christ loved the church, Ephesians 5 and verse 25, Christ is not one example, he is the example. As Paul was using marriage as an example of how Christ is, and the church relate to one another, submit, how the relationship is. So now we're kind of flipping that back around when we come to this side of the men and saying, all right, now your example is Christ. How the church submits to Christ and what type of leader Christ is. Now that's what you have to be. Love is not defined by feeling, but rather by his actions. Marriage is measured against Christ, not against culture. Marriage is measured against Christ, not against culture. Christ's love is sacrificial. He gave himself up for her. It gives, not takes. Love costs. It does not convenience. Christ did not preserve himself, rather he gave himself. And that is, I didn't take time here to read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but through these next couple slides, you're going to see a lot of things coming out of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul talks about what love is and the characteristics of love. I didn't take time to put that verse fully in here, but some of those aspects and some of those characteristics are going to be kind of baked into this as we look at Christ's example of love from the book of Ephesians. So we see his love is sacrificial, and we see his love is purposeful. He did not die randomly, he died with a purpose. His love seeks the good of the one who is loved. Without that, where would we be? Ephesians chapter 2 answers that question very clearly. You are dead. You are dead in your trespasses and sins. But God, the great love wherein he loved us, we know he sent his son to die for us. So we find God's purpose, and then we find what Christ accomplished there in chapter 2. And that grace in which we have been saved. His love seeks the good of the one loved. It is not self-serving. Love is directed outward. Love is directed outward. Everything Christ did was for the church. All the things that he did, all the lessons that he taught, all the people that he healed to show his miraculous power and his divine authority, all the suffering that he went through, all the sacrifices that he made, all of those things were for one purpose, the church. We find that mystery revealed to us there in chapter 3 of Ephesians. Christ's love is sanctifying. That leads us down into verse 26 and 27. But his love cleanses and sets apart. His love is tied to truth, washing with the word. His love does not leave the church as it is, but rather transforms her, builds her up into something that is beautiful, something that is holy and set apart, without blemish, he says in 26 and 27. Love moves us towards holiness. Christ's love defines leadership. Headship is not control. Headship is sacrifice. Authority is expressed not through rule giving, but rather through service and serving others. Leadership is measured by what is given, not what is taken. Leadership is measured by how well we're able to sacrifice ourselves, by how well we're able to put ourselves into those positions to build up and to nurture and to cherish. Christ leads by laying down his life. Before we get into 26 and 27, we'll go ahead and end right there. Our time is pretty much up anyway. Christ was willing to give up everything. Christ was willing to make sure that his bride, the church, had everything she needed to be nurtured, to flourish, to be beautiful, to be without spot and without blemish. And Christ was willing to pay whatever cost was necessary that might be the case. Are we living up to that example of Christ as men, as husbands? Wives, are you living up to the example of the church as she submits herself to Christ? We've looked at both parties here this morning. Haven't spent a whole ton of time on them, but we've had some pretty deep lessons on our individual roles, not too awful long ago. I think at this point it was probably about 2 years though, but as we looked at the Hard Truths from the Bible series. Are we living up to our roles today? Are we submitting? Are we leading in a proper manner? But now let's bring that around to us as Christians as well, though. Because as Christians, we are the bride of Christ. Are we submitting to Christ as he would have us submit to him? Have we given our lives to him? Has he washed us with his blood that we might be without spot or without blemish? Are we living faithfully to that? If not this morning, then why not? We have opportunities to make things right, whether it's to give our life to Christ through baptism, having repented of sins and confess Christ as the Son of God, or whether we need to come back and be faithful once again to our calling and to our covenant.